My stepmother spent 3 years trying to push me out of my father's Wyoming mineral empire. But it only took her exactly 10 minutes at airport security to destroy her own life. The TSA conveyor belt ground to a jarring halt. A loud mechanical screech echoed off the vaulted timber ceilings of the Jackson Hole Airport. I watched my stepmother, Diane. Her signature smug smile froze. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a sickly, chalky gray. She expected the uniformed federal agents swarming Lane 4 to intercept me. Instead, they rushed right past my shoulder. They unholstered their weapons and locked their sights on my 23-year-old half-sister, Ashley. Before I explain how a spilled cup of coffee triggered a federal raid, welcome to Zara Told Stories. Let me know your age and where you are listening from in the comments down below, and hit subscribe if you believe karma always collects its debts. 45 minutes earlier, the pristine VIP lounge felt like a gilded cage. I am 34 years old. As the director of mineral rights for my father's extraction firm, my life revolves around high plains grit, precision, and airtight legal contracts. I usually avoid forced family vacations, yet here I sat, cornered in a leather armchair. Diane sat across the glass table, swirling a mimosa. She sighed loud enough to ensure my father James heard her over his ongoing business call. The freight fees for international shipping these days are pure extortion, Diane lamented, adjusting her silk scarf. Especially for a special gift. You practically need a private jet just to move a package across borders. My father nodded without looking up, lost in a complex negotiation regarding a new geothermal lease. Ashley stood near the buffet, tapping fast on her phone screen. She wore an oversized designer sweater and an expression of curated boredom. Without warning, she pivoted. She marched toward our seating area, her platform boots clicking sharply against the polished hardwood. She did not stumble. She did not catch her heel on the rug. I saw the calculated shift in her weight right before she lunged forward. The scalding matcha latte left her cup in a perfect arching wave. The dark green liquid splashed directly across my legs, soaking into my slacks, and splattered heavy drops over my rugged canvas suitcase resting by my chair. I cataloged the temperature of the spill immediately. Hot enough to sting my skin, but not enough to leave a real burn. The smell of sweet, earthy green tea filled the air. "Oh, wow, I am so clumsy today," Ashley recited. Her tone held zero genuine regret. It sounded like a badly rehearsed line from a daytime soap opera. Before I could even stand up, Diane sprang from her chair with unnatural speed. She grabbed a thick stack of cocktail napkins, bypassing me entirely, to hover over my luggage. "Laura, you need to go clean yourself up right this second," Diane commanded, her voice carrying a sharp, theatrical edge. "Go to the restroom. I will handle your bag." She placed both hands firmly on my suitcase's retractable handle. Her knuckles turned white from the tight grip. She pointed toward the marble corridor at the far end of the terminal, refusing to let me touch my own property. Diane thought I was just a rugged, unobservant geologist who would never suspect a domestic ambush. She assumed I would blindly follow orders. I walked away, but the moment I stepped out of her line of sight, the analytical side of my brain took over. I know a trap when I see one. Now I just needed to figure out exactly what she was hiding in my bag. The Jackson Hole VIP restroom felt like a sanitized icebox. The chilled marble floors clicked beneath my boots as I walked toward the farthest sink. I dropped my canvas bag onto the granite counter. The dark green matcha stain was already settling into the durable fabric, but I did not reach for the soap dispenser. My trousers were soaked, the hot liquid clinging uncomfortably to my skin and sending a distracting chill up my legs. Yet my attention remained fixed entirely on the luggage hardware. I audit multi-million-dollar extraction contracts for a living. When a vendor tries to bury a penalty clause on page 47 of a geothermal lease, my job is to find it before the ink dries. Growing up around the Wyoming oil fields teaches you to look beneath the surface. My father built his mineral empire on a foundation of ruthless attention to detail, and he passed that exact trait down to me. You learn very quickly that the most dangerous threats never announce themselves loudly. They hide in the microscopic details, buried under layers of misdirection. I leaned close to the brass TSA lock securing the main compartment of my rolling bag. A fresh, jagged scratch marred the polished metal casing. It was small, but to a trained eye it screamed of forced entry. Someone had shoved a key into the cylinder in a severe hurry. My mind instantly recalled Diane's peculiar household habit. For years, she insisted on holding a master ring of spare keys for every piece of luggage in our home. She always claimed it was a necessary precaution for international travel, a way to keep the family organized. Now the true purpose of her controlling nature was glaringly obvious. She wanted uninterrupted access to our belongings. I unzipped the main compartment. The scent of spilled, sweet green tea gave way to the familiar smell of my packed wool sweaters and rugged hiking gear. I pushed the folded garments aside, running my fingers along the structured seams of the suitcase floor. A slight, unnatural elevation in the internal lining caught my attention. The fabric pulled slightly tighter than usual across the plastic backing. It was a flawless concealment job, the kind of meticulous work that easily fools an exhausted traveler or a distracted customs agent checking hundreds of bags a day. But I was neither exhausted nor distracted. I located the hidden zipper tucked beneath a fabric flap and pulled it back. The cavity between the nylon shell and the rigid plastic frame was exposed. I expected to find a generic shoebox, perhaps a brick of illegal narcotics meant to trigger a standard trafficking charge. A stunt like that would guarantee Diane got what she wanted. She wanted me locked in a federal holding cell, disgraced in the public eye, and permanently disinherited from the family trust. But the shape resting in the hollow space defied those expectations entirely. It was a heavy, cylindrical object wrapped tightly in layers of clear, industrial packing tape. My breath caught in my throat. The chill of the restroom faded, replaced by a sudden rush of adrenaline. I recognized the dimensions instantly. It was a geological core sample tube, the exact kind our field engineers use to transport sensitive drilling data across the high plains of Wyoming. I leaned closer, narrowing my eyes at the faint markings visible beneath the thick layers of tape. The transparent casing revealed rolled documents, not rock samples. The distinctive blue grid lines of highly classified topographical survey maps pressed against the curved plastic. Next to them, the gold foil seals of Wyoming state mineral lease deeds caught the harsh fluorescent restroom light. The reality of the situation crashed over me like a sudden avalanche. This was not a petty domestic revenge plot. Diane and Ashley were not just trying to frame me for carrying recreational contraband to annoy my father and ruin a vacation. They were smuggling proprietary corporate secrets. If airport security found these specific documents in my direct possession, I would not just face a simple possession charge. I would be indicted for federal corporate espionage. Stealing classified extraction surveys from James Bailey's firm was a felony that carried decades in federal prison. A rival mining corporation, perhaps one of the overseas conglomerates we recently outbid for the Yellowstone border tracts, would pay a fortune for this exact data. The maps detailed untapped mineral veins worth billions. Diane intended to hand our competitors the keys to our empire, using my suitcase as the oblivious courier. When the TSA inevitably pulled my bag for a secondary search, the resulting federal scandal would obliterate my professional career. It would sever my ties to the family trust and provide Diane the perfect smokescreen. She could complete her treasonous transaction, while my father scrambled to hire elite defense attorneys to keep his oldest daughter out of a penitentiary. Panic is a useless emotion. It clouds judgment, slows reaction times, and leads to fatal mistakes. I felt a cold, sharp focus settle over my thoughts. I knew better than to touch a planted piece of federal evidence with my bare skin. I refused to leave a single microscopic trace of my DNA on that plastic casing. I stepped over to the automatic dispenser and pulled a thick stack of dry paper towels. Layering them carefully over my palms, I created a makeshift pair of thick protective gloves. Slowly, I reached into the hidden cavity of the suitcase and gripped the edges of the heavy cylinder. I lifted it out, keeping the paper towels firmly pressed against the tape. The sheer weight of the tube confirmed how many stolen deeds were packed inside. Knowing the exact nature of the threat shifted my entire strategy. Removing the immediate danger was my only priority. I turned to my oversized winter coat resting on the counter. The thick, rugged wool was designed to withstand sub-zero Rocky Mountain blizzards, making it incredibly heavy and structured. I opened the deep interior sleeve and slid the geological tube inside. The bulky fabric swallowed the cylinder effortlessly, concealing its shape without leaving a single suspicious bulge. It looked exactly like a normal winter coat folded over an arm. I zipped the internal lining of my suitcase back into place. I smoothed the nylon fabric until it looked entirely undisturbed. I locked the brass hardware, picked up my canvas bag, and draped the heavy winter coat over my left arm. I took one final look in the mirror, adjusting my expression to project a blend of mild annoyance and naive compliance. I needed to look like a woman who just wasted 10 minutes failing to clean a coffee stain. I stepped out of the restroom and walked smoothly back into the bustling VIP lounge. The ambient noise of clinking glasses, rolling wheels, and boarding announcements masked the rapid beating of my heart. I scanned the seating area with a practiced, casual glance. My father was still typing on his laptop, deeply absorbed in his email. Ashley was checking her makeup in her phone camera, practically vibrating with eager anticipation. Diane sat upright, her eyes darting toward me the second I re-entered her field of vision. She searched my face for any sign of panic or discovery. I offered none. Instead, I walked over to my chair and focused all my physical energy on my leather laptop briefcase resting on the table. I let out a loud, exaggerated sigh of frustration. I flipped the metal clasps of the briefcase shut with a sharp, audible snap. I twisted the combination lock dials with deliberate, rigid movements. I ensured Diane saw how fiercely I was securing my personal work bag. It was a calculated piece of theater, designed to draw her focus exactly where I wanted it. Diane's eyes tracked my hands. She stared intensely at the leather briefcase, a silent smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. She thought I was acting paranoid about my work documents. She was convinced her geological tube was still safely hidden inside my rolling luggage. Her gaze remained locked on the briefcase, entirely missing the heavy wool coat draped over my arm. She swallowed the bait without a single moment of hesitation. The pieces were now in motion, and she had no idea the board had just been flipped. Returning to the VIP lounge, the air conditioning hit the damp fabric of my slacks, sending a sharp shiver down my calves. I ignored the discomfort. My heart beat with a slow, rhythmic thud, anchoring my focus. The lounge buzzed with the low hum of wealthy travelers, clinking silverware, and soft jazz overhead. I kept my chin level, allowing my eyes to sweep the room with practiced, icy serenity. My father stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back turned to the room. He spoke rapidly into his phone, gesturing with his free hand as he outlined the terms of a new geothermal extraction site. James Bailey built a multi-million-dollar firm from the dirt up, navigating the treacherous terrain of Wyoming mineral rights with unmatched grit. Yet for all his brilliant corporate foresight, he possessed a fatal domestic blind spot. He could spot a bad contract from a mile away, but he remained utterly oblivious to the predators sharing his dinner table. A few feet away, Ashley was entirely consumed by her own reflection. She had balanced a portable ring light on the edge of the side table, angling the bright white halo to illuminate her face. She adjusted the collar of her oversized designer sweater, checking her angles in her smartphone camera. Her thumbs flew across the screen, preparing a live stream. She was giddy, practically vibrating with the anticipation of broadcasting her sister being hauled away in handcuffs. She wanted the internet to witness my downfall, turning a federal arrest into viral entertainment. Diane sat exactly where I left her, swirling the last drops of her mimosa. Her eyes darted toward me the second I crossed the threshold. She scrutinized my posture, searching for any trace of panic, any subtle twitch that would indicate I had found her hidden surprise. I gave her nothing. I kept my face as readable as a slab of granite. My theatrical performance with the combination lock had worked flawlessly. Diane kept glancing at my leather laptop briefcase resting on the table, a self-satisfied smirk playing on her lips. She believed the stolen topography maps and lease deeds were locked tight inside my rolling luggage or secured in that leather satchel. Her fixation on the briefcase acted as the perfect blind spot. She entirely missed the heavy winter coat draped casually over my left arm. I did not rush. Hurrying draws the eye. I walked with an unhurried, steady pace across the plush carpet. My path to my chair naturally took me right past Ashley. She sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her legs crossed, entirely focused on typing a caption for her upcoming broadcast. Resting on the floor next to her boots was her designer tote bag. It was a cavernous, unstructured piece of imported lambskin, dyed a pale blush pink. The top zipper remained wide open, exposing a chaotic jumble of expensive travel accessories. I saw a silk sleep mask, a bulky makeup pouch, and a thick, folded cashmere travel blanket resting right at the top. The bag was practically yawning, an inviting target, waiting for a payload. I stopped for a fraction of a second, shifting my weight, as if avoiding a passing waiter. I positioned myself directly beside the open tote. My left arm, draped in the thick wool coat, hovered just inches above the gaping bag. With a smooth, silent motion, I tilted my forearm downward. I slipped my hand inside the deep sleeve and released my grip. Gravity took over. The dense geological core sample tube slid down the interior lining of the coat. It slipped out of the cuff and dropped directly into the maw of Ashley's tote bag. The heavy cylinder landed with a soft, muffled thud, instantly swallowed by the plush folds of the cashmere travel blanket. The entire transfer took less than 2 seconds. It was a fluid, invisible strike. I continued my stride without missing a single beat. I reached my chair, sat down, and draped my empty winter coat over the backrest. I crossed my legs, folded my hands in my lap, and offered Diane a polite, chilling smile. She smiled back, raising her mimosa glass in a silent mock toast. She thought she had outsmarted the rugged geologist. She thought she had engineered a masterstroke of corporate espionage and domestic sabotage. She had no idea the lethal weapon she prepared was now resting snugly inside her own daughter's purse. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a simple antibacterial wet wipe. I turned my attention to my gray canvas rolling suitcase. The dark green matcha latte had dried into a sticky crust on the exterior pocket. I pressed the wipe against the fabric and began to scrub. The contrast between our worlds became starkly apparent in that mundane action. My suitcase was built for the unpredictable weather of the high plains. The treated, heavy-duty canvas repelled the spill effortlessly. With 3 firm swipes, the green stain vanished, leaving the tough material unblemished and ready for the next storm. Wyoming resilience wiped clean, showing no signs of the attempted damage. A few feet away, the reality was entirely different. Ashley's imported lambskin tote was an object of pure vanity, designed to carry lip gloss and credit cards. It was never engineered to bear the dragging, dense weight of commercial geological hardware. The thick plastic tube, packed tightly with stolen corporate survey maps, exerted a severe, localized downward force. I watched the bottom of the blush pink bag sag unnaturally against the hardwood floor. The fine, intricate stitching along the lower seams began to stretch the thin luxury threads groaning silently under the intense pressure. The fragile designer facade was already failing, tearing apart from the inside out. It was a perfect physical manifestation of their fragile lies buckling under the crushing weight of reality. My father ended his phone call, sliding his device into his suit pocket. He turned around, rubbing his temples, looking weary but satisfied with his negotiation. "All right," James announced, checking his watch. "The boarding display just updated. We need to head through the security checkpoint now if we want to make the flight. Grab your things." Ashley let out an exaggerated sigh, complaining about the early hour. She pocketed her ring light and hoisted the lambskin tote by its thin leather straps. Her wrist strained slightly, her shoulder dipping from the sudden, unexpected weight. A brief flicker of confusion crossed her face, but she was too distracted by an incoming text message to process the anomaly. She simply adjusted her grip and slung the heavy burden over her shoulder. I stood up, gripping the handle of my freshly cleaned canvas luggage. Diane fell into step right beside me. She walked entirely too close, invading my personal space. The psychological warfare was transitioning into its next phase. She wanted to unnerve me, to provoke a reaction she could point to when the authorities arrived. She leaned in, the scent of expensive perfume and citrus masking the venom in her intent. She was preparing to lay the groundwork for my guilt, ready to play the concerned maternal figure watching her stepdaughter unravel. I maintained my icy composure, stepping forward into the terminal concourse. The final pieces of her elaborate snare were clicking into place, but Diane was blindly marching herself toward the executioner's block, eagerly anticipating the drop of the blade. The transition from the VIP lounge to the main concourse felt like stepping out of a quiet sanctuary into a wind tunnel. The Jackson Hole Airport security checkpoint was a bottleneck of frantic energy. The ambient noise swelled into a dull roar composed of the hum of industrial imaging scanners, the scuff of rubber soles on terrazzo floors, and the sharp voices of uniformed officers directing the flow of human traffic. We merged into the winding switchbacks of Lane 4. My father walked ahead, his focus already drifting back to the spreadsheets glowing on his smartphone screen. He navigated the velvet ropes on autopilot, detached from the subtle domestic warfare unfolding mere inches behind his back. Diane slid into the narrow space directly behind me. She ignored the unspoken rules of personal distance, letting the shoulder of her cashmere cardigan brush against my jacket. I could feel the heat radiating from her skin. She wanted a front row seat to my destruction. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. The thrill of her own deception acted as a physical high, pumping adrenaline through her veins. She leaned close, projecting her voice just enough to ensure the TSA agent stationed near the metal detector could hear her clearly. "Laura, are you feeling all right?" Diane asked her, pitch dripping with counterfeit maternal concern. "You look incredibly flushed. You are sweating. Why are you acting so paranoid?" It was a calculated performance. She was planting seeds. When the authorities inevitably ripped my luggage apart and paraded me through the terminal in steel cuffs, Diane wanted them to remember the anxious, sweating suspect she had, oh so helpfully, pointed out. She needed to establish a behavioral baseline of guilt in the minds of the officers. She wanted to script my downfall before the opening curtain even lifted. I did not turn my head. I kept my gaze fixed on the gray plastic bins stacked at the front of the queue. If Diane understood anything about my career, she would know her amateur psychological tactics were pathetic. Sitting across a boardroom table from veteran Wyoming roughnecks and negotiating $100 million mineral leases teaches you how to control your pulse. I have stared down hostile land developers threatening to bankrupt our extraction firm over disputed territory. I have spent weeks untangling labyrinthine legal contracts designed to steal our acreage. A bored socialite trying to play mind games in an airport security line barely registered on my radar. I maintained a clinical, stony neutrality. I offered no defensive arguments to her fabricated accusations. I did not wipe my brow, shift my weight, or engage in the petty theater. I stepped up to the stainless steel rollers and began the mundane choreography of the screening process. I grabbed 3 empty bins from the stack. The hard plastic clattered against the metal table. I placed my laptop in the first. I took off my boots, setting them neatly in the second. Finally, I unzipped my winter coat. The same thick wool garment that had just served as the invisible transport vehicle for her stolen geological core sample tube. I folded the heavy fabric flat in the third bin, making sure the sleeves were tucked away. I hoisted my gray canvas rolling suitcase onto the conveyor belt. It sat there, durable and unassuming, devoid of the contraband she thought it carried. Right behind me, Ashley let out a sharp sigh of profound inconvenience. She hated the screening process. She considered the removal of her footwear a personal insult. She grabbed a single bin and carelessly threw her belongings inside. The pale blush-pink lambskin tote landed with an uncharacteristic heavy thud. The folded cashmere travel blanket shifted slightly upon impact, but the deep cavernous design of the bag kept the dense plastic cylinder perfectly hidden from sight. I watched out of the corner of my eye as the bottom of her designer purse sagged against the rigid ridges of the bin. The delicate leather groaned under the dense weight of classified corporate espionage. Ashley did not notice the extra bulk. She was too busy typing a text message with one hand while struggling to unzip her boots with the other. She was walking into a federal trap of her own making, entirely consumed by her digital reflection. We shuffled forward toward the document check pedestal. The TSA officer, a stern woman with tired eyes and a crisp blue uniform, scanned my father's digital boarding pass, then mine. Diane stepped up next, handing over her identification with a dazzling, practiced smile. She wanted to be remembered. She needed to look like the perfect, law-abiding citizen caught in the tragic crossfire of her stepdaughter's criminal choices. "You folks have a lot of carry-on items today," the officer noted dryly, glancing at the pile of luggage stacking up on the motorized rollers. Diane chuckled. It was a light, airy sound that grated against my eardrums like sandpaper. She gestured toward Ashley, who was leaning against the steel railing, reapplying a coat of shimmering lip gloss. "Oh, you know how it is, officer," Diane boasted, her voice ringing out crisp and clear over the ambient noise of the checkpoint. "But my daughter and I are impeccable packers. We are very organized. We know exactly what is inside our bags." I stared at the back of Diane's perfectly styled hair. The sheer magnitude of her arrogance was breathtaking. She had just looked a federal security agent directly in the eye and claimed total ownership of a bag currently housing stolen topographic surveys and proprietary lease deeds. She tied the noose stepped onto the trapdoor and handed the lever to the authorities. The dramatic irony was so thick it felt tangible in the stale airport air. She believed she was driving the nail into my coffin, unaware she was sealing her own fate into the public record. I stepped away from the pedestal and walked into the advanced imaging technology scanner. I raised my arms and placed my feet on the faded yellow markers painted on the floor. The glass panels enclosed me. As the scanning mechanism rotated around my body, issuing a low electronic hum, I watched the scene unfold on the other side of the glass. The gray plastic bins containing our belongings began their slow, inevitable crawl toward the thick black rubber curtains of the X-ray tunnel. My canvas suitcase led the procession. Ashley's lambskin tote followed close behind, riding the grooved belt like a ticking time bomb. The federal agents stood by their monitors, their faces illuminated by the pale blue glow of the screens, waiting to inspect the inner contents of our lives. The countdown had officially reached 0, and the executioner was about to flip the switch. The automated voice inside the advanced imaging technology scanner directed me to hold my stance. I planted my boots firmly on the faded yellow footprints painted on the floor and raised my arms above my head. The thick glass panels felt restrictive, forming a transparent cage that held me suspended in a critical moment of vulnerability. The scanning wand rotated rapidly around my frame, issuing a low, rhythmic electronic hum. It searched for hidden anomalies beneath my clothing, entirely blind to the tactical maneuvering I had just executed out in the open. A bright green arrow illuminated on the glass display, granting me passage. I stepped out of the confined space and walked over to the long stainless steel collection table. My father stood at the far end of the lane, threading his leather belt back through the loops of his tailored trousers. His eyes were glued to his smartphone screen, already drafting a complex email to his board of directors regarding the geothermal leases. He remained blissfully ignorant of the high-stakes game concluding mere inches away from his shoulder. The motorized conveyor belt hummed with monotonous efficiency. The thick black rubber curtains covering the exit of the X-ray tunnel parted. My durable gray canvas suitcase emerged into the harsh fluorescent light of the terminal. I kept my peripheral vision locked on the TSA operator stationed behind the reinforced glass partition. His posture told the entire story of my success. He slumped in his ergonomic chair, a bored expression etched deeply into his tired features. His eyes swept over the high-definition digital rendering of my neatly folded wool sweaters and rugged hiking gear. The indicator lamp mounted directly above his station burned a steady, reassuring emerald green. No red flags, no secondary inspection required. The threat was entirely absent. I reached forward, pulling my luggage off the metal rollers with a smooth, fluid motion. I unclipped the latches of my plastic bin. I retrieved my laptop, sliding it securely into the padded compartment of my leather briefcase. I shrugged on my winter coat, the heavy fabric settling comfortably over my shoulders, now that the burdensome payload was gone. I projected the aura of a seasoned traveler enduring a routine inconvenience. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I simply stood my ground, arranged my belongings, and waited for the pendulum to swing back in the opposite direction. Diane hurried through the standard metal detector. She ignored her own shoes waiting in the adjacent bin, opting to stand barefoot on the freezing terrazzo floor. Her gaze was cemented to the dark opening of the X-ray tunnel. She waited for the grand finale she had spent hours orchestrating. She expected blaring sirens. She expected armed guards to tackle me to the cold tile. 5 seconds ticked by. Then 10. The emerald light above the belt maintained its bright, untroubled glow. I watched the manufactured concern on her face fracture and crumble. Her jaw went visibly slack, her mouth hanging open in silent disbelief. A distinct nervous tremor started in her left hand, shaking the gold bangles around her wrist. Her eyes darted frantically from my perfectly ordinary suitcase back to the empty conveyor belt. She blinked rapidly, trying to force the reality in front of her to match the script in her head. She could not process the failure of her trap. For 3 years, Diane had operated on the assumption of her own sheer infallibility. She had spent countless hours weaving a delicate web of lies, slowly turning my father against me with whispered accusations and orchestrated domestic misunderstandings. She thought she was the smartest person in the room, playing a sophisticated game of chess against a naive geologist. Watching her brain short-circuit under the weight of an inexplicable defeat provided a profound, quiet satisfaction. The foundation of her reality was cracking, and she had no idea how to patch the holes. Right behind her, Ashley sauntered through the metal detector. She dragged her stockinged feet, looking profoundly annoyed by the security protocols interrupting her morning. She held her phone in one hand, swiping through social media feeds, entirely disconnected from her physical surroundings. Her plastic bin, carrying the pale, blush-pink lambskin tote bag, disappeared through the heavy rubber curtains and entered the scanning chamber. I shifted my attention back to the TSA operator. The casual boredom on his face evaporated in a fraction of a second. His spine went rigid, snapping him upright in his chair. He leaned close to his glowing monitor, his brow furrowing in deep, intense concentration. I knew exactly what he was analyzing on that screen. Modern X-ray imaging utilizes specific color mapping to identify varying material densities. Organic items like clothing and food render in soft orange hues. Light metals and electronics display as bright green. But dense, thick plastics encasing rolled topographical surveys and heavy geological sediment render as an opaque, impenetrable blue-black mass. A solid, unidentifiable anomaly of that size screams corporate espionage, or worse, a lethal threat. The operator did not hesitate. He did not ask for a secondary opinion from a supervisor. He raised his hand and slammed his palm down hard on a large red button mounted on his control console. The motorized belt locked instantly. A harsh, grinding mechanical screech echoed through the terminal, the terrifying sound of heavy steel gears forced to a sudden and unnatural halt. The ambient chatter of hundreds of travelers died out in a single heartbeat. The sudden silence was deafening, a vacuum waiting to be filled by chaos. A row of bright yellow warning strobes mounted on the ceiling directly above Lane 4 ignited. They pulsed in a rapid, synchronized pattern, casting frantic, alternating shadows across the faces of everyone in the immediate vicinity. A piercing electronic siren joined the strobes, cutting through the stale airport air with urgent, high-pitched wails. The civilian transit hub mutated into a tactical lockdown zone in the blink of an eye. Passengers in the adjacent screening lanes froze. People dropped their shoes and backed away from the metal detectors, their faces pale with sudden fear. Ashley finally looked up from her glowing phone screen. She frowned, clearly irritated by the loud noise disrupting her texting, still entirely unaware that the strobing yellow lights were targeting her specific bin. The operator stood up from his chair, using his body to physically block the exit of the scanner tunnel. He unclipped a heavy radio from his duty belt, shouting rapid tactical codes into the receiver. Less than 5 seconds later, the rhythmic thud of heavy boots striking the tile floor announced the arrival of the Federal Response Team. Heavily armed officers, clad in dark tactical gear, swarmed Lane 4. They moved with terrifying precision, forming a tight perimeter around the X-ray machine and the stainless steel inspection tables. They shouted authoritative commands, ordering the surrounding passengers to step back and keep their hands visible. The trap Diane had meticulously engineered had finally sprung shut, but the iron teeth were locked firmly around her own daughter's belongings. The strobe lights painted the terminal in harsh, alternating flashes of blinding yellow. The siren cut through the air, a high-pitched mechanical shriek that paralyzed every traveler in the vicinity. People froze mid-step, abandoning their shoes and laptops on the conveyor belts, shrinking back against the walls of the checkpoint. The mundane frustration of airport security vanished, replaced by the distinct, metallic taste of genuine fear. I stood perfectly still, watching the tactical execution of a protocol I had triggered merely by refusing to be a victim. My father stood frozen at the end of the lane. He was a man who spent his entire adult life cultivating an impenetrable aura of control. James Bailey commanded boardrooms, directed drilling operations across the treacherous Rockies, and demanded respect from the toughest roughnecks in Wyoming. He engineered his public image with the same exacting precision he used to survey geothermal vents. Seeing him paralyzed, his smartphone still glowing in his hand with an unfinished email to his investors, highlighted the stark divide between his corporate brilliance and his domestic blindness. He had no protocol for this. The Wyoming grit that defined his career offered no protection against the spectacle unfolding before him. A senior tactical officer broke through the perimeter. He moved with a heavy, purposeful stride, his dark uniform contrasting sharply against the sterile white tiles of the checkpoint. He did not shout or draw his weapon. His authority radiated from his silence and his swift, unhesitating movements. He stepped directly to the locked X-ray belt and gripped the edges of the gray plastic bin containing the blush pink lambskin tote. He hauled the bin onto a stainless steel inspection table. The metal groaned slightly under the unexpected weight of the cargo. The officer pulled a pair of blue nitrile gloves from a dispenser on his belt. The snap of the synthetic rubber stretching over his fingers sounded like a rifle crack in the suddenly quiet terminal. He did not look at Ashley, who was standing just a few feet away, her mouth slightly ajar, still holding her phone in a manicured grip. He reached into the designer bag. The delicate leather yielded to his gloved hands as he pushed aside a silk sleep mask, a bulky cosmetic pouch, and a cashmere travel blanket. His fingers found the rigid, cylindrical shape buried at the bottom. He gripped the center of the geological core sample tube and lifted it out into the harsh fluorescent light. The heavy plastic casing gleamed, wrapped tightly in thick, clear packing tape. Through the transparent sections, the distinctive blue grid lines of classified topographical maps and the gold foil seals of state mineral deeds were highly visible. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like a bizarre piece of sporting equipment or a simple mailing tube. But to a seasoned federal security officer stationed at an airport serving wealthy corporate executives and extraction tycoons, the concealment profile was unmistakable. This was a textbook corporate espionage transport method designed to smuggle proprietary data across state and international lines. The officer's jaw tightened. He recognized the severity of the threat instantly. He did not open the tube. He did not attempt to peel the tape to verify the documents. He gently placed the heavy cylinder back onto the stainless steel table, treating it with the extreme caution usually reserved for a live explosive device. He took 2 deliberate steps backward, establishing a hard physical boundary between the evidence and the surrounding civilians. He raised his shoulder radio to his mouth, pressing the transmission button. His voice was low-clipped and devoid of emotion. He issued a series of specific tactical codes, requesting immediate backup from the Federal Investigative Division. The words echoed through the silent corridor. The transit hub was no longer a civilian space. It was a secured crime scene, locking down every exit and entrance within a mile radius. I turned my gaze toward Ashley. The curated, arrogant persona she broadcast to her thousands of internet followers dissolved in real time. Her carefully practiced posture collapsed, her shoulders slumped, and the phone she used to document her glamorous life slipped slightly in her trembling fingers. She blinked rapidly, her wide eyes darting back and forth between the stern officer and the heavy cylinder resting on the table. She looked exactly like a cornered animal realizing the trap had sprung. For her entire life, Ashley had operated under a protective umbrella provided by her mother. Diane had always smoothed over her mistakes, paid off her debts, and shielded her from the consequences of her own terrible decisions. Ashley expected that same invisible shield to deploy right now. She turned her head, searching frantically for her mother, expecting Diane to step forward, flash a charming smile, and talk their way out of this bizarre misunderstanding. Diane did not step forward. She remained rooted to the terrazzo floor, her face the color of wet ash. Her eyes were fixed on the geological tube, recognizing the very item she had personally stolen and planted. The realization that her weapon was in the wrong bag anchored her feet in concrete. She offered no reassuring words, she provided no maternal comfort. She just stared at the evidence, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. Her mind was a chaotic blur, unable to compute how her flawless plan had backfired so spectacularly. The senior officer turned his attention directly to Ashley. He closed the distance between them in 2 swift strides, his boots echoing loudly on the tile. He did not ask for her identification. He did not ask her to explain the contents of her bag. He treated her as an immediate, hostile threat to national corporate security. "Ma'am, interlock your fingers and place your hands behind your back," he ordered, his tone leaving zero room for negotiation. Ashley let out a breathy, confused laugh, shaking her head as if the officer had just told a bad joke. Wait, what? No, there is a mistake. That is not mine. I did not even know what that is. You are ruining my sweater. Do you know who my stepfather is? The officer did not repeat his command. He grabbed her right wrist, twisting her arm firmly but professionally behind her back. Ashley gasped, dropping her phone. The device hit the hard floor, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of cracked glass. The digital lens she planned to use to film my demise lay broken at her feet. The officer grabbed her left wrist, bringing it to meet the right in a practiced, inescapable motion. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed over the silent terminal. It was a cold, unforgiving sound. It represented the abrupt end of her manufactured reality and the beginning of severe, uncompromising legal consequences. The cold steel bit into her wrists. The physical sensation of the restraints shattered her denial. Ashley dropped to her knees on the cold tile. A raw, guttural scream tore from her throat, a sound born of sheer, unfiltered terror. She thrashed her shoulders, crying out for her mother, begging for someone to stop the nightmare. Her wails echoed off the high ceiling, transforming the security checkpoint into a theater of ultimate humiliation. My father witnessed the entire sequence from the end of the lane. His hand went limp. The expensive leather briefcase he had carried across 5 continents slipped from his fingers. It hit the terrazzo floor with a heavy thud, popping the brass latches and spilling a handful of printed contracts onto the tiles. His pristine, carefully managed family image disintegrated in seconds. He stared at his youngest daughter, kneeling in handcuffs surrounded by armed federal agents. He looked at his wife, paralyzed and silent. The empire he built on logic and legal precision offered no defense against this domestic catastrophe. The psychological shock rendered him mute, a captain watching his ship sink from the dock. I watched them unravel. I felt no pity. I felt the steady, calm rhythm of a ledger finally balancing itself out. But the reckoning was far from over. As the federal agents tightened their perimeter, isolating Ashley from the rest of the passengers, the true test of their toxic alliance approached. A federal investigator stepped into the lane, his eyes scanning the crowd looking for anyone traveling with the suspect. The ultimate question of loyalty hung in the air, and I knew exactly how Diane would answer it. The echo of the snapping steel restraints hung in the sterile terminal air. A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the security checkpoint, broken only by the rhythmic static crackling from the tactical radios. Ashley remained on her knees, her designer clothes pooling awkwardly on the cold terrazzo floor. Her initial wails had devolved into ragged, breathy sobs. The reality of federal custody was an iron weight crushing her manufactured vanity. A plainclothes federal investigator stepped through the perimeter of uniformed officers. He wore a rumpled gray suit that contrasted sharply with his piercing, observant eyes. He did not look at the contraband resting on the stainless steel table. He looked at the crowd of frozen passengers. He scanned the faces, searching for the micro-expressions that betray association. His gaze swept past the terrified tourists and the bewildered business travelers before landing directly on our fragmented group. He noted my father standing motionless near the metal detector, a man visibly broken, surrounded by scattered contracts. Then the investigator looked at Diane. "Are any of you traveling with this young woman?" the investigator asked. His voice was calm, steady, and incredibly dangerous. It was the kind of question that demanded an immediate, honest answer, or guaranteed a charge of obstruction. I watched my stepmother process the inquiry. Growing up in the high-stakes environment of Wyoming mineral extraction, I have witnessed countless alliances fracture under pressure. When a multi-million-dollar lease goes south, corporate partners turn on each other with brutal efficiency. But the betrayal I witnessed in that airport terminal was far more visceral. It was a masterclass in primal self-preservation. Diane had always treated Ashley less like a daughter and more like an extension of her own ego. Ashley was a pawn to be dressed up, paraded around country clubs, and utilized as a weapon in Diane's relentless campaign to secure control over my father's wealth. Their bond was not forged in maternal affection. It was a transaction. And in the face of a federal indictment for corporate espionage, Diane calculated that the transaction was no longer profitable. The maternal instinct is supposed to be an unbreakable tether. Diane severed it in a fraction of a second. She took a rapid step backward, her expensive leather heels clicking sharply against the tile. Then she took another, and a third. She physically distanced herself from the kneeling, sobbing girl who shared her bloodline. It was a deliberate geographic declaration of abandonment. Diane raised both of her hands high into the air, palms facing outward, adopting the universal posture of total surrender and feigned innocence. "I have absolutely no idea what that item is," Diane announced. Her voice rang out clear and shrill, piercing the heavy silence of the checkpoint. She made sure every single badge-wearing officer in the vicinity heard her distinct denial. "She packed her own luggage this morning." Diane continued, her words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate rush. "She is an adult. I have nothing to do with her personal belongings. You need to hold her entirely responsible for her own actions. I am just a bystander." The investigator narrowed his eyes, studying the older woman who had just thrown her child to the wolves. Even the hardened tactical officers exchanged brief, bewildered glances. The sheer ruthlessness of the act was staggering. Diane was willing to watch her daughter face decades in a federal penitentiary if it meant keeping her own wrists free of steel. On the floor, Ashley stopped crying. The ragged sobs caught in her throat, replaced by a sharp intake of breath. She lifted her head, her ruined makeup smearing across her pale cheeks. She stared at the woman who had birthed her, guided her, and ultimately orchestrated this exact criminal enterprise. For her entire life, Ashley had obeyed Diane's every command, eager to reap the financial rewards of their shared deceit. She had willingly participated in the plot to frame me, excited by the prospect of inheriting my share of the Bailey family trust. But hearing those words, hearing her mother publicly discard her like a piece of defective luggage, triggered a catastrophic psychological shift. The shock of the betrayal evaporated. It mutated instantly into a pure, unadulterated rage. A toxic, fiery hatred ignited in Ashley's eyes, burning away the last remnants of her curated influencer persona. She was no longer a spoiled socialite playing a game. She was a cornered, betrayed animal, and she was going to take her predator down with her. Ashley lunged forward. The sudden, violent movement caught the officers off guard. She thrashed wildly against the heavy steel handcuffs, her shoulders jerking as she tried to break the inescapable hold. The metal chains clinked and rattled harshly, a chaotic soundtrack to her fury. Two tactical agents immediately grabbed her arms, forcing her back down to the tile. But they could not silence her. "You liar!" Ashley screamed. The sound tore from her lungs with a feral intensity, bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. Her vocal cords strained raw and cracking. "You absolute liar!" Diane flinched, taking another coward step backward, but there was nowhere left to hide. The spotlight was firmly fixed, and Ashley was eager to direct the beam. "You have the master keys," Ashley bellowed, thrashing her head toward her mother. "You carry the spare keys to every single bag in the house. You set this whole thing up. You told me to stand in front of you in the lounge so no one would see you planting it." The investigator's posture shifted. He pulled a small notebook from his breast pocket, his pen clicking open. The mundane security breach had just escalated into a coordinated, multi-person conspiracy, and the primary suspect was confessing the blueprint right on the floor of the terminal. "She is lying!" Diane shrieked, her composed facade fracturing into genuine panic. Her hands shook violently in the air. "She is hysterical. She is making up insane stories to save herself. I did not plant anything." "Do not listen to her," Ashley sobbed, spit flying from her lips as she struggled against the agents pinning her shoulders. "She wanted to frame Laura. She wanted to put the maps in Laura's bag so Dad would cut her out of the will. I watched her do it. Arrest her. Arrest my mother. She is the one who stole the documents." The precise mention of the topography maps and the frame-up changed the entire atmosphere. Ashley had just confirmed the nature of the contraband without being prompted by law enforcement. She validated the espionage angle, tying Diane directly to the theft of my father's proprietary corporate data. My father, still standing by the metal detector, let out a low, agonizing groan. The sound was barely audible, a physical manifestation of a man watching his world burn to ash. James Bailey had spent years ignoring the subtle red flags, choosing the path of least resistance at home while fighting ruthless battles in the boardroom. Now the toxic rot he allowed to fester had breached the surface, exposing a staggering level of criminal malice. He looked at Diane, his eyes wide with a horrified, sickening clarity. He finally saw the predator hiding beneath the designer clothes. The investigator snapped his notebook shut. He had heard enough to establish probable cause. He raised his hand, gesturing sharply to a pair of uniformed officers standing near the perimeter. "Detain the mother," the investigator ordered. "Read them both their rights and separate them immediately. I want them in different holding rooms." The officers moved with swift, merciless efficiency. They approached Diane, ignoring her frantic protests and her wildly flailing arms. One officer grabbed her left wrist, pulling it firmly behind her back. Diane let out a high-pitched gasp of disbelief, her eyes darting toward my father, pleading silently for a rescue that was never going to come. James turned his face away. He stared at the blank wall, severing his emotional ties in a single, devastating motion. The second pair of handcuffs clicked shut, securing Diane's wrists. The architect of the snare was now bound by the very chains she had intended for me. The poetic symmetry of the moment was flawless. As the agents hauled both women to their feet and marched them away from the security lanes, the investigator turned his sharp gaze toward my father and me. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the fallout was just beginning. The criminal justice system is a relentless machine, and it demands fuel. "You two are coming with us as well," the investigator stated, pointing toward a set of unmarked doors down the concourse. "We have a lot of questions about how classified geological surveys ended up in a designer purse, and you are going to provide the answers." I offered a single calm nod, stepping forward to gather my father. The trap had closed, but the real interrogation was about to begin, and I possessed the exact evidence required to finish the demolition. The walk away from the chaotic security lanes felt like descending into a subterranean vault. The federal agents escorted my father and me down a long, narrow corridor, bathed in harsh fluorescent lighting. The buzzing overhead fixtures emitted a sterile, synthetic hum that replaced the frantic sirens of the main terminal. They ushered us into a windowless interview room. The heavy metal door clicked shut behind us, sealing away the outside world. The space was designed specifically to induce psychological discomfort. The walls were painted a dull institutional gray. A single stainless steel table sat bolted to the linoleum floor, flanked by 3 rigid metal chairs. The temperature was deliberately kept a few degrees too cold, a classic interrogation tactic meant to keep subjects physically on edge. I took a seat, my posture straight, resting my hands flat on the cool metal surface. I felt right at home in the corporate extraction business. I have spent countless hours in sterile boardrooms just like this one, staring down hostile federal regulators and relentless land auditors. The geography changes, but the game remains identical. My father sat in the chair beside me, James Bailey, a titan of Wyoming industry, looked like a man who had just survived a high-speed collision. His broad shoulders slouched. The tailored fabric of his expensive suit hung awkwardly on his frame. He stared blankly at his own hands resting on the table. The calluses on his palms, earned from decades of gripping steel rig pipes in the freezing cold, seemed to mock the invisible domestic snare that had just caught him. For 3 years he had chosen the path of least resistance. He allowed Diane to curate his reality, trusting her charming facade while ignoring the subtle, isolating wedge she drove between us. He was a brilliant strategist when mapping subterranean mineral veins, yet he missed the toxic fractures spreading through his own living room. The shock of watching his wife publicly abandon her child, followed by the revelation of stolen corporate blueprints, had stripped away his final layer of denial. I watched a profound, crushing guilt settle into the deep lines of his face. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize for his years of willful blindness, but the heavy door swung open before he could form a single syllable. The plainclothes investigator from the checkpoint stepped into the room. He carried a manila folder and a small digital audio recorder. He did not offer a handshake or introduce himself by name. He pulled out the third metal chair and sat across from us, dropping the folder onto the table with a loud, calculated smack. He pressed a button on the recording device, the red light glowing like a miniature warning beacon. He leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, his piercing eyes shifting from my father to me. He was evaluating our stress levels, searching for the microscopic tells of guilt, sweaty palms, darting, eyes, rapid breathing. I gave him a blank, unblinking stare. The investigator decided to play his opening gambit. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the steel table, and locked his gaze onto mine. He informed us that Diane was currently sitting in an identical gray room just down the hall. According to his summary, she was not remaining silent. She was singing a very detailed, highly composed tune. Diane was officially waiving her right to an attorney for the moment, eager to provide a sworn statement to the authorities. Her narrative was a masterpiece of fabricated victimhood. She claimed the entire security checkpoint disaster was a ruthless setup, orchestrated entirely by me. The investigator read from his notes, his tone flat and heavily steeped in practiced skepticism. Diane described me as a deeply resentful, unstable woman. She painted a tragic picture of a jealous spinster daughter, furious over the new family dynamics and desperate to protect her inheritance. According to her sworn statement, I was the one who stole the classified geological core samples from my father's private study. She insisted I planted the heavy tube inside Ashley's designer tote bag out of pure spite, hoping to trigger a federal arrest that would permanently ruin my half-sister's life and secure my position as the sole heir to the Bailey empire. Diane claimed she and Ashley were merely innocent bystanders, collateral damage in my twisted psychological warfare. The sheer audacity of the lie acted like a defibrillator on my father. The paralyzing shock that had kept him mute instantly evaporated, replaced by a fierce protective fury. The stoic Wyoming oilman roared back to life. James slammed his palms down on the stainless steel table. The loud metallic bang echoed sharply in the small room. He pushed his chair back, his face flushing a dark, angry crimson. He was ready to unleash hell on the investigator, prepared to tear Diane's fabricated statement to shreds and defend his daughter's honor. He opened his mouth, drawing a deep breath to deliver a blistering counterattack. I did not let him speak. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over his wrist. I applied a steady, downward pressure, anchoring him to the present moment. I did not look at him, keeping my eyes fixed securely on the investigator. But the physical command was unmistakable. Do not engage. Do not argue. In the realm of legal combat, getting defensive is synonymous with looking guilty. arguing against a lie validates the premise that the lie is worth debating. I learned a long time ago that you never fight a fabricated narrative with emotional outrage. You annihilate it with objective, verifiable data. James clamped his jaw shut. He swallowed the impending outburst, trusting my silent directive. The tension in his arm remained a coiled spring, waiting for release, but he slowly lowered himself back into his seat. The investigator watched our silent exchange, his expression remaining neutral, though a flicker of curiosity danced behind his eyes. He expected a screaming match. He expected hysterical tears and frantic denials. My clinical detachment clearly disrupted his standard interrogation playbook. I folded my hands neatly in my lap. I did not raise my pitch, maintaining a calm conversational tone. I told the investigator that I understood Diane's strategy. It is human nature to deflect blame when facing the crushing weight of a federal indictment. I did not insult her character or attempt to defend my own. I simply bypassed the emotional bait entirely. I engaged my corporate compliance training, shifting the paradigm from a domestic dispute to a technical audit. I informed the agent that high-end commercial aviation hubs operate under intense federal security mandates. Jackson Hole Airport caters to billionaires, politicians, and corporate executives. Therefore, their liability and surveillance infrastructure is world-class. I calmly requested a simple, immediate technical verification. I asked him to suspend the verbal interrogation and pull the high-definition CCTV footage from the redundant security grid covering the VIP lounge. I was incredibly specific. I did not ask for a general review of our morning. I directed him to locate the camera angles covering the seating area near the glass windows, and the secondary feeds monitoring the corridor leading to the marble restrooms. I detailed the exact time window, a narrow 15-minute margin starting from the moment the matcha tea spilled. I explained that video evidence is immune to jealousy, resentment, and familial politics. It does not possess a motive. It simply records photons. If Diane's sworn statement held any merit, the cameras would show me planting the geological tube. However, if she was lying to a federal officer to cover up a multi-million-dollar instance of corporate espionage, the digital grid would expose her perjury in crystal-clear resolution. I leaned back in the rigid metal chair, offering a polite, expectant nod. The burden of proof no longer rested on my shoulders. I had handed the investigator a map, and now he just needed to walk down the hall and look at the screen. The fragile house of cards Diane had built was about to meet a digital hurricane. The heavy metal door swung inward, its hinges groaning softly against the silence of the interrogation room. The federal investigator reappeared, pushing a rolling metal cart that held a sleek, flat-screen monitor and a secure laptop terminal. He did not speak immediately. He moved with the methodical, unhurried pace of a man who held all the cards and was simply waiting for the right moment to lay them on the table. He locked the wheels of the cart and booted up the system. Seconds later, a second set of heavy footsteps approached. 2 uniformed tactical officers escorted my stepmother into the room. Diane wore the expression of a seasoned actress preparing for the role of a lifetime. Her posture was flawless. She held her chin high, projecting an aura of aggrieved innocence mixed with profound maternal sorrow. She glanced at my father, her eyes wide and glistening with manufactured tears, attempting to silently beg for his protection. James did not meet her gaze. He stared straight ahead at the blank monitor screen, his jaw set like a Wyoming boulder. The officers directed Diane to the remaining chair at the far end of the stainless steel table. She sat down, smoothing the wrinkles from her cashmere cardigan, looking entirely out of place in the sterile, institutional environment. She expected a verbal sparring match. She expected to leverage her refined, practiced charm against a gruff federal agent. She did not expect an immediate presentation of objective digital reality. Mrs. Bailey, the investigator began, his tone polite, but entirely devoid of warmth. Before we proceed with finalizing your sworn statement, your stepdaughter has requested that we review the security footage from the Jackson Hole VIP lounge. Standard procedure dictates we verify all physical timelines. Diane offered a small, hesitant smile. Of course, officer. I have nothing to hide. I am eager to clear up this terrible misunderstanding. I am just so worried about Ashley. The investigator tapped a few keys on the laptop. The large monitor flickered to life, displaying the high-definition feed from a camera mounted in the ceiling of the VIP lounge. The timestamp in the corner confirmed it was exactly 45 minutes prior. The silent, grainy video showed our seating area. The visual quality was excellent, capturing the expensive leather chairs and the floor-to-ceiling windows. However, the angle was flawed. A thick structural pillar partially obscured the view of my rolling canvas suitcase. The camera caught Ashley spilling the matcha latte, and it caught me walking away toward the restroom. But the crucial moment, the 2 minutes Diane spent hovering over my luggage, was largely blocked from sight. You could see her shifting around the pillar, but you could not clearly see her hands or the brass lock on my bag. Diane noticed the obstruction immediately. I watched the subtle, victorious shift in her body language. Her rigid shoulders relaxed. The tight lines around her mouth softened into a faint, arrogant smirk. She believed she had caught a lucky break. She thought the digital eye of the federal government possessed a fatal blind spot, leaving the truth shrouded in ambiguity. Without clear visual evidence of her planting the geological tube, the case would devolve into a muddy he said, she said scenario. She was confident she could outlie me in a courtroom. As you can see, Diane sighed, shaking her head sadly. The camera does not show much. I was simply trying to clean up a spill. I am telling you, Laura had that awful package with her the entire time. The investigator did not react to her commentary. He leaned forward, clicking the mouse. You are correct, Mrs. Bailey. The ceiling feed is obstructed. Fortunately, we obtained a secondary, highly detailed visual record from an entirely different source. Diane frowned, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. Another source I do not understand. There are no other cameras in that corner. Not airport cameras, no, the investigator clarified, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp cadence. But your daughter Ashley is currently cooperating fully with our cyber division. In exchange for consideration regarding a plea agreement, she willingly unlocked her smartphone and granted us complete access to its contents. The color drained from Diane's face. The faint, arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a sudden sickening dread. The investigator tapped another key. The video feed on the large monitor switched abruptly. The grainy, elevated ceiling perspective disappeared, replaced by a brightly lit, razor-sharp ground-level view. It was a vertical video, shot in stunning 4K resolution. The lighting was impeccable, enhanced by a portable halo ring light. Ashley had set up her smartphone on a side table to capture her own flawless reflection. She was preparing to livestream the chaotic aftermath of my impending arrest. She wanted her thousands of internet followers to witness the spectacle of her rugged, geology-obsessed sister being hauled away in handcuffs. The camera focused primarily on Ashley's face as she adjusted her sweater and practiced her surprised expressions. But modern smartphone lenses feature incredibly wide fields of view. While Ashley occupied the foreground, the background of the shot captured our entire seating area with devastating clarity. There were no pillars. There were no blind spots. The camera stared directly at my gray canvas suitcase. The silent video played out in real time. My father watched the screen, his chest rising and falling with heavy, ragged breaths. The digital footage showed me walking away toward the restrooms. The second I disappeared from the frame, the background action ignited. The video captured Diane moving with frantic, predatory speed. The microphone on Ashley's phone was highly sensitive, picking up the clear, distinct sound of Diane rummaging through her designer purse. The 4K resolution highlighted the small brass spare key gleaming in Diane's hand. The camera recorded her sinking to her knees beside my luggage. It captured the exact, undeniable moment she forced the master key into the TSA lock, popping a zipper open. "Oh my God," my father whispered, his voice cracking. He gripped the edge of the steel table, his knuckles turning stark white. The video continued, a flawless, objective witness to a felony. Diane unzipped her own oversized handbag and pulled out the heavy, tape-wrapped geological core sample tube. The distinctive blue grid lines of the stolen topographical surveys were highly visible through the clear packing tape. Diane shoved the dense cylinder deep into the lining of my canvas suitcase, zipped it shut, and secured the lock. The entire process took less than 90 seconds. The digital breadcrumbs left by Ashley's vanity had formed an unbreakable chain of evidence. The very tool they intended to use to humiliate me had captured their crime in glorious, undeniable high definition. The irony was suffocating. The investigator paused the video right on a frame showing Diane's face contorted in intense concentration as she planted the stolen corporate secrets. He turned his chair facing the older woman directly. "The Cyber Division also extracted the recent text message history between you and your daughter," the investigator stated, his tone relentless. "We have dozens of explicit messages documenting this coordinated attempt to frame Laura Bailey. We have texts discussing the procurement of the geological surveys and your specific intent to trigger a federal arrest to secure control of the Bailey Family Trust." Diane sat paralyzed in her rigid metal chair. The sophisticated, charming mask she had worn for years was entirely annihilated. She stared blankly at the paused frame of her own guilty face on the monitor. She could not speak. She could not breathe. The objective digital reality had crushed her elaborate lies into dust. There was no charm, no manipulation, and no fabricated narrative that could argue against 4K resolution and time-stamped text messages. She looked at my father, her eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea. But James had already severed the tether. He refused to look at her, his eyes burning with a fierce, glacial anger. The frame-up was exposed, but the true depth of Diane's malice was about to be revealed. The theft of those specific geological surveys pointed to a motive far more sinister than simple domestic jealousy. The federal investigator was about to pull a thread that would unravel a multi-million-dollar corporate conspiracy, and the man holding the ledger was standing right outside the door. The oppressive quiet in the interrogation space felt heavy enough to suffocate. Diane sat frozen, her posture crumbling beneath the irrefutable weight of the digital recording. The investigator watched her, letting the silence stretch, allowing the reality of her perjury to settle deep into her bones. My father remained rigid, his breathing shallow, processing the staggering depth of his wife's deceit. The domestic illusion he had funded for years lay in ruins across the stainless steel table. Before the investigator could formally demand her confession, the heavy metal door groaned on its industrial hinges. It swung inward, pulling a rush of chilled air from the corridor. Ethan stepped over the threshold. He did not look like a man arriving for a leisurely vacation to Europe. My fiancé wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, though the tie was pulled loose at his collar, indicating long hours of relentless focus. Shadows pooled beneath his eyes, a testament to a night devoid of sleep. He carried a reinforced leather briefcase in his right hand, gripping the handle with a white-knuckled intensity. Ethan is the lead forensic auditor for my father's mineral extraction enterprise. While the rest of the family packed bags for the airport, he had stayed behind in Jackson Hole. His official excuse involved a backlog of routine quarterly compliance filings. The reality was far more severe. A second figure followed Ethan into the cramped room. It was David Caldwell, the senior litigation counsel for the Bailey firm. David was a formidable presence, a man who only appeared when the company faced existential threats. His tailored navy trench coat and grim expression transformed the atmosphere instantly. This was no longer a simple transit security dispute. The arrival of lead counsel signaled a full-scale corporate emergency. The jurisdiction had just expanded from local law enforcement to federal financial crimes. Seeing Ethan standing there, armed with legal representation and a leather briefcase, sent a vivid memory rushing to the forefront of my mind. It was mid-January 2 years ago, on the desolate high plains of the Powder River Basin. The Wyoming winter had descended with a punishing, bone-chilling ferocity. Temperatures hovered well below zero, freezing the condensation on the inside of our makeshift command trailer. The smell of diesel fuel and ozone hung thick in the cramped space. The primary heating unit had failed hours earlier, leaving us huddled in thick insulated parkas, our breath pluming into white vapor with every spoken word. We were auditing a newly acquired drilling operation, poring over years of fragmented supply chain logistics. The ambient hum of the distant rigs vibrated through the metal floorboards. I stood behind Ethan, leaning over his shoulder as he navigated a labyrinth of digital ledgers on dual glowing monitors. He was a brilliant accountant, but he was new to the specific, rugged nuances of the mineral extraction industry. I was teaching him how to hunt. I pointed a gloved finger at a recurring expense line buried deep within a subcontractor invoice sheet. I explained the anatomy of a phantom vendor. In the extraction business, thieves do not steal cash from a vault. They steal via fraudulent procurement. They create fake logistics companies, generating pristine purchase orders for silica sand, heavy machinery lubricants, or specialized drill bits. The invoices look flawless to a standard accountant. The math balances perfectly. But I taught Ethan to look beyond the spreadsheet. I instructed him to cross-reference the delivery dates with the gate security logs and the physical inventory manifests. A phantom vendor submits a bill for 10,000 gallons of industrial lubricant, but the gate logs show no tanker truck ever arrived on that specific date. The money flows out to a shell company, while the physical product never actually exists. In that freezing trailer, fueled by stale black coffee and sheer determination, we isolated 3 phantom vendors, siphoning capital from the subsidiary. Ethan caught on with terrifying speed. His analytical mind synchronized with my operational knowledge, forging a lethal, unshakable partnership. We became apex predators in the financial ecosystem, capable of dismantling the most sophisticated embezzlement structures ever conceived by greedy executives. That shared history radiated between us now. Ethan met my gaze across the sterile interrogation room. A silent communication passed between us, an acknowledgement of the trap we had jointly anticipated and successfully sprung. Ethan stepped forward, breaking the tense silence. He approached the stainless steel table, placing the reinforced leather briefcase flat on the cool metal surface. The sound drew the attention of everyone in the room. The federal investigator leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the new arrivals. He recognized David Caldwell from previous high-level corporate inquiries, instantly understanding that the scope of his morning had just broadened exponentially. My father looked up, his expression a mixture of profound exhaustion and bewildered relief. He viewed Ethan as a trusted confidant, a steady pillar in his chaotic empire. Ethan James croaked his voice, raw from the emotional toll of the past hour. "What is going on? Why are you here? You are supposed to be back at the main office." Ethan did not smile. He maintained a stoic, professional demeanor. He unclasps the twin brass locks on the briefcase. The sharp clicks echoed like rifle fire in the confined space. "I never intended to join the vacation," James Ethan stated, his tone level and precise. "Laura and I coordinated this timeline weeks ago. We needed Diane out of the estate and distracted by her own schemes so I could access the restricted internal servers without triggering her automated security alerts. Diane flinched, as if she had been physically struck. Her eyes darted from Ethan to the leather briefcase, a fresh wave of terror washing over her pale features. She had spent the entire morning believing she was the puppet master, orchestrating my demise to protect her secrets. She was only now realizing that her elaborate snare was nothing more than a diversion we had allowed her to execute. We gave her enough rope to weave her own hangman knot. Ethan opened the lid of the briefcase. He reached inside and extracted a thick, wire-bound document. The cover page bore the official insignia of our forensic accounting division, stamped with a bright red, highly confidential seal. He placed the heavy binder directly in the center of the table, sliding it gently until it rested equidistant between the federal investigator and my father. "This is a preliminary forensic audit," Ethan explained, tapping the cover with his index finger. "I bypassed the standard quarterly review schedule. I spent the last 48 hours tearing apart the localized supply chain ledgers, cross-referencing every single vendor payment approved by the Internal Finance Department over the last 36 months. David Caldwell stepped forward, taking his place beside Ethan. The attorney crossed his arms, his presence serving as a grim reminder of the legal avalanche poised to crash down on the room. "The authorities will need to secure the original digital hard drives immediately," David informed the investigator, his voice smooth but unyielding. "My client is prepared to waive corporate confidentiality to facilitate a full federal inquiry. What you are about to see goes far beyond a simple domestic dispute or a smuggled geological survey." Diane stared at the bound report as if it were a venomous predator preparing to strike. Her hands began to tremble again, the manicured fingernails clicking faintly against the steel table. The frame up at the security checkpoint, the stolen topographical maps, the ruthless abandonment of her own daughter, all of it was a desperate, panicked smokescreen. She had tried to orchestrate a catastrophic family crisis to force my father into a psychological tailspin, hoping to indefinitely postpone this exact audit. She wanted me locked in a penitentiary, calculating that James would drain his energy and resources fighting for my freedom, leaving her free to quietly erase her digital footprints. But the ledger was now on the table. The numbers were finalized printed in unforgiving black ink. Ethan rested his hand on the cover of the audit, preparing to open the first page. The true depth of the betrayal and the staggering financial motive driving Diane's treason was about to be dragged into the harsh, fluorescent light. Ethan flips open the heavy binder. The crisp sound of the thick paper turning echoes off the institutional gray walls. He does not rush. He moves with the deliberate, unyielding precision of a surgeon preparing to excise a tumor. He extracts a single printed spreadsheet and places it directly in the center of the stainless steel table. The harsh fluorescent overhead light glares off the stark black ink. My father stares down at the columns of numbers, his brow furrowed. The raw, emotional exhaustion from watching his family implode is still fresh on his face, but the businessman inside him instinctively kicks into gear. He reads the headers: vendor payouts, logistics contracts, procurement schedules. Ethan points a silver pen at a cluster of highlighted rows near the bottom of the page. 3 years ago, you integrated Diane into the operational oversight team. Ethan begins, his voice carrying the calm, steady rhythm of a man presenting undisputed facts. You wanted to consolidate the daily cash flow approvals. You gave her authorized clearance to sign off on independent contractor invoices for the Powder River Basin extraction sites. My father nods slowly, the memory souring in real time. It was a move he made to appease Diane, a gesture of trust meant to weave her into the fabric of his legacy. He thought he was building a partnership, merging his professional empire with his personal life. He was actually handing a thief to the combination. I ran a deep diagnostic on the top 3 transport vendors operating out of the northern sector. Ethan continues, sliding a secondary document across the steel surface. Apex Logistics Frontier Hauling, and Summit Transport. Over the past 36 months, these three entities billed the firm for heavy machinery transit and silica sand delivery. The invoices were processed, approved, and paid on time every single quarter. Ethan pauses, letting the silence command the room. None of those companies exist, James. There are no flatbed trucks. There are no storage depots. I ran the tax identification numbers through the state registry. They track back to a single anonymous post office box in Cheyenne. The invoices were fabricated from thin air, rubber-stamped by the internal finance desk, and the capital was wired directly into ghost accounts. My father's breathing hitches. He reaches for the paper, tracing the column of totals with a trembling finger. The Wyoming grit that defined him is useless against the sterile, undeniable mathematics of theft. He looks up, his eyes searching Ethan's face for a miscalculation, a glimmer of hope that this is a simple accounting error. "How much?" James asks, his voice barely a hollow whisper. $4 million, Ethan replies, his tone unwavering. 4 million drained from the operational budget, bled out in increments small enough to bypass the automated quarterly alerts, but steady enough to hollow out your cash reserves. The staggering sum drops onto the table like a lead weight. $4 million. Diane had not just skimmed the edges of his wealth. She had orchestrated a sustained, parasitic drain on his life's work. I turn my gaze toward my stepmother. She sits rigid, her spine pressed hard against the back of the metal chair. Her chin is tucked down her eyes, squeezed shut, as if she can somehow block out the auditory evidence of her ruin. She looks small, fragile, stripped of the designer armor she wore like a second skin, but the revelation is far from over. The true chilling sociopathy of her scheme lies in the routing numbers. Ethan turns to the next tab in his binder. The funds did not stay in Cheyenne. The dummy corporations acted as a funnel, washing the capital before transferring it to an offshore holding trust in the Cayman Islands. He produces a printed banking manifest, placing it directly in front of the federal investigator, who leans forward with keen, predatory interest. International banking regulations require a primary physical signatory for trust establishment, Ethan explains. Look at the name on the account, James. My father squints at the fine print on the manifest. The color drains from his face entirely, leaving his skin a sickly pale hue. He drops the paper as if the ink itself had burned his fingertips. The name on the offshore trust is Ashley. The realization strikes me with a chilling physical force. The betrayal I witnessed earlier at the security checkpoint, Diane taking 3 steps back, throwing her daughter to the federal wolves, was not a sudden panicked reaction. It was the culmination of a long-term, highly calculated strategy. Diane had used her own biological child's social security number and identity to establish the offshore shell companies. She knew the forensic audit was inevitable. She knew that eventually a diligent accountant would trace the missing $4 million back to the Cayman Trust. When that day arrived, Diane intended to feign ignorance. She had positioned Ashley as the ultimate fall guy. She was prepared to let her 23-year-old daughter take the entirety of the blame for a multi-million-dollar federal financial crime, ensuring her own hands remained legally clean. The investigator lets out a low, slow breath, realizing he is not just dealing with a petty smuggler trying to cause domestic drama. He is sitting across the table from a ruthless financial predator, a woman devoid of any fundamental human loyalty. The puzzle pieces snap together in my mind, forming a terrifying, cohesive picture. I look at Diane, finding my voice. I do not shout. I speak with the cold, measured cadence of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. This was never about a simple family vacation, I state, drawing the attention of the entire room. You found out Ethan was preparing a comprehensive internal ledger review. You knew your phantom vendors would never survive a forensic stress test. The timeline was closing in on you. Diane keeps her eyes squeezed shut, her head shaking in a pathetic, rhythmic denial. But she offers no vocal defense. She knows the digital paper trail is unassailable. You needed a smokescreen. I continue laying out the architecture of her treason. You needed a crisis so severe, so consuming, that it would halt the corporate financial review indefinitely. What stops an audit? A catastrophic family emergency. I gesture toward the hallway, pointing toward the security lanes where the trap was initially set. You stole those classified topographical maps from Dad's private study. You slipped them into my luggage, planning to trigger a federal espionage arrest at the TSA checkpoint. You wanted me locked in a holding cell, facing decades in a penitentiary. The sinister scope of her ambition is breathtaking. She did not just want to cut me out of the family will, she wanted me caged. She calculated that my sudden, shocking arrest would break my father psychologically. She expected James to drop everything, abandoning his firm to spend his days meeting with elite defense attorneys, draining his energy and his capital fighting for my freedom. You expected him to fall apart? I tell her, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. You needed him distracted for 30 days, just long enough for you to wire those offshore funds into untraceable offshore crypto accounts, pack your bags, and flee the jurisdiction, leaving your husband broken, your stepdaughter in prison, and your own biological child holding the bag for your embezzlement. The silence returns heavier and more suffocating than before. The federal investigator scribbles furiously on a legal pad, documenting the layout of the conspiracy. David Caldwell, the corporate attorney, stands tall, his posture radiating a grim readiness to unleash a tidal wave of litigation. I turn to look at my father. The profound exhaustion that had weighed down his shoulders just moments ago is gone. The shock has burned away, consumed by a terrifying, silent wrath. The man who built an empire out of Wyoming rock and steel is finally waking up to the reality of the parasite he invited into his home. The domestic illusion is dead, and the retribution is about to begin. My father did not blink. The printed banking manifest rested on the cold steel table, yet his eyes looked right through the paper. The silence in the interrogation room stretched tight, humming with the underlying voltage of a gathering storm. For 3 years, James Bailey operated under a perilous illusion. He built his extraction empire by reading the subtle fractures in limestone and shale, predicting exactly where the earth might give way. Yet he missed the fault lines running beneath his own dining room table. Now the seismic shift was tearing his reality apart in real time. I watched the exact moment the grief evaporated from his posture. The sorrow that had slouched his broad shoulders vanished, replaced by a terrifying, glacial calm. The muscles in his jaw locked into sharp relief. His hands, previously trembling with the shock of interpersonal betrayal, curled into tight, unforgiving fists. The Wyoming wildcatter returned to the surface. The man who routinely stared down federal regulators and hostile corporate raiders reclaimed his territory. He looked up, his gaze shifting from the offshore account details directly to my face. The unspoken apologies resonated in the quiet space between us. I saw the gears turning behind his eyes as he recontextualized the last 36 months of his life. Every whispered complaint Diane ever made about me took on a sinister new meaning. Every time she suggested my compliance audits were too strict or that my presence at Sunday dinners caused unnecessary friction, she was executing a calculated maneuver. She had painted me as a bitter, territorial daughter, unable to accept a new marriage. James finally understood the architecture of her deceit. Her criticisms were never about blended family dynamics. They were a tactical perimeter. By keeping me isolated and on the defensive, she kept my forensic gaze away from her phantom vendors. She manipulated his protective instincts, using his desire for domestic peace as a shield for her systemic theft. She pushed you out of the Sunday executive meetings, James rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. Last November, when you requested the procurement ledgers for the Powder River project. She told me you were trying to undermine her authority in front of the board. I offered a slow, measured nod. She needed a firewall, Dad. I was asking questions about transport costs that did not align with our fuel consumption metrics. If I looked at those invoices for more than 5 minutes, the ghost companies would have unraveled. She had to ensure you saw my inquiries as a personal attack rather than a professional audit. David Caldwell, standing rigid in his tailored navy trench coat, cleared his throat. The senior litigation counsel recognized the precise moment a client transitioned from a defensive posture into an offensive strike. James, the federal authorities require your formal declaration, David stated, his tone smooth but unyielding. Do we waive the internal corporate protections and grant them unrestricted access to the offshore routing data? My father did not hesitate. He did not ask for a moment to consider the implications of sending his wife to a federal penitentiary. The tether was severed. Give them everything, James commanded. Open the servers, turn over her email archives. I want every single dime tracked, and I want the architect of this fraud held to the highest penalty under the law. A sharp, frantic thud echoed through the room, startling the investigator. The sound originated from the adjacent observation booth. The walls of the federal holding facility featured reinforced one-way mirrors. We could not see into the neighboring room, but the sudden commotion indicated the occupants could see and hear us. Another heavy thud rattled the glass, followed by a frantic scratching noise. A speaker mounted in the corner of our ceiling crackled to life. An officer in the adjacent room had engaged the intercom microphone during a physical struggle. James, listen to me. Diane flooded our sterile room with her voice. The refined, cultured tone she spent decades perfecting was gone. It was replaced by a shrill, breathless panic. They are lying. Ethan is lying. The paperwork is forged. We could hear the chaotic scuffle through the static overhead. Diane was hurling her body against the reinforced window, desperate to break through the impenetrable barrier. Ashley did this, Diane shrieked her lies, mutating at the speed of terror. Ashley set up those accounts. She stole my passwords. James, you know how greedy she is. You cannot let them do this to me. I am your wife. The federal investigator frowned, reaching for the wall panel to sever the audio feed. My father stopped him with a single raised hand. James kept his palm suspended in the air, a universal gesture demanding total, uninterrupted silence. He did not look at the mirrored glass. He did not turn his head toward the source of the frantic pleading. He stared straight ahead at the cinder block wall, his expression carved from ice. He let his wife scream. He forced himself to listen to the ugly, desperate sound of a predator caught in her own snare. Diane continued to throw her biological daughter under the proverbial bus, offering up Ashley as a sacrificial lamb in a futile attempt to save her own skin. The sheer toxicity of her words served as the final required proof of her guilt. She possessed zero loyalty, zero remorse, and zero humanity. After 30 agonizing seconds, James slowly lowered his hand. He looked at the investigator. "Turn it off," my father instructed, his tone devoid of any lingering affection. "And finish your job." The federal agent nodded, a flicker of genuine respect passing over his hardened features. He gathered his notepad, unclipped a set of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt, and walked toward the connecting door. The heavy latch clicked open. We sat in silence as the investigator stepped into the adjacent holding cell. The intercom was dead, but the thick walls could not muffle the sudden, authoritative boom of the agent's voice. Diane Bailey, the investigator, announced his words, carrying the crushing weight of the justice system. "You are under arrest for suspicion of corporate espionage, wire fraud, and the trafficking of stolen proprietary data. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The familiar recitation of rites echoed through the plaster, signaling the official end of her reign. The sound of the cuffs ratcheting closed was the final punctuation mark on a 3-year nightmare. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the reality of the moment wash over me. The trap was neutralized. The enemy was in chains. But neutralizing a threat is only the first phase of a true corporate defense strategy. The infection had been isolated, but the structural damage to the empire remained. My father turned his gaze toward David Caldwell. The emotional reckoning was over. The tactical purge was about to begin, and James was preparing to freeze the very ground Diane walked on. The heavy metal door of the interview room opened, and my father and I stepped back into the public corridor of the Jackson Hole Airport. The transition from the claustrophobic interrogation space to the expansive concourse felt jarring. The ambient noise of the terminal had returned to its standard low hum. The yellow strobe lights were dark. The sirens were silent. The civilian world had resumed its mundane rhythms, entirely oblivious to the tectonic shifts that had just occurred beneath its surface. We stood near a set of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the restricted tarmac. A crisp Wyoming breeze swept across the runway, carrying the scent of aviation fuel and impending snow. Below us, a gray armored transport vehicle idled near a security gate. We watched the conclusion of the federal protocol. 2 armed agents escorted Ashley out first. She was no longer screaming. The raw panic had exhausted her physical reserves, leaving her hollow and pliant. She shuffled toward the open rear doors of the van, the steel cuffs securing her wrists in front of her. Her blush-pink lambskin tote bag, now officially logged as federal evidence, was carried by a 3rd officer. The fragile designer purse sagged pathetically, the seams visibly splitting from the heavy burden it was never meant to bear. Diane emerged a moment later. She did not shuffle. Even in handcuffs, she attempted to maintain a shred of her manufactured dignity. She held her chin high, trying to project the image of a wronged socialite enduring a temporary indignity. But the facade was crumbling at the edges. Her cashmere sweater was rumpled, her perfect hair disheveled. As she approached the van, she hesitated, glancing back over her shoulder toward the terminal windows. She could not see us through the tinted glass, but she knew we were watching. She was searching for a lifeline, a final opportunity to manipulate her way out of the snare. She found nothing. The federal agents directed her firmly into the back of the transport vehicle. The heavy metal doors slammed shut, severing her connection to the outside world. The van accelerated away, merging onto the restricted access road, carrying the architect of our domestic nightmare toward a federal holding facility. My father did not look away until the vehicle disappeared around a concrete hangar. The silence between us stretched heavy with the unsaid weight of the last 3 years. He had finally seen the truth stripped of all artifice and charm. The woman he trusted had nearly destroyed his eldest daughter and plundered his life's work. James Bailey did not offer apologies. He did not seek comfort. The Wyoming wildcatter inside him took total control. He reached into his suit pocket and retrieved his smartphone. He dialed a number, his thumb pressing the screen with decisive force. The emotional reckoning was finished. The tactical purge was beginning. David Caldwell, the senior litigation counsel, answered on the first ring. "David, we are initiating a total asset freeze," James commanded, his voice devoid of any hesitation. The tone was lethal, precise, and uncompromising. "I want emergency injunctions filed with the state court immediately. Every joint bank account, every shared investment portfolio, every real estate deed with her name attached, lock it all down." I stood beside him, listening to the systematic dismantling of Diane's financial power. James was not waiting for the slow grind of the criminal justice system. He was executing a corporate scorch earth protocol. Next contact, the Human Resources Director, James continued his pace, relentless. Formally revoke Diane's executive financial clearance. Terminate her employment contract effective immediately. The grounds are gross corporate misconduct, fraud, and active federal criminal charges. Have the IT department scrub her access credentials from the main servers, disable her email, her keycards, and her remote login privileges. I want her completely excised from this firm before the hour is up. He ended the call, his breathing steady, his focus laser sharp. The infection was being isolated and starved. For 3 years, Diane had weaponized his wealth, using his resources to build her phantom empire. Now the very foundation she stood upon was vanishing beneath her feet. Meanwhile, miles away in a sterile downtown holding facility, Diane was attempting to execute her final countermeasure. The federal intake process is a methodical, dehumanizing experience. They take your shoelaces, your belt, and your personal effects. But before they lock the cell door, they grant you a single phone call. Diane sat in the holding room, her wrists finally free of the steel cuffs. The federal agent stood near the door, his expression bored and detached. Diane picked up the heavy plastic receiver. She did not call a family member. She did not call a friend. She dialed the direct line of the most expensive, aggressive defense attorney in the state. She was a woman accustomed to buying her way out of trouble. The attorney answered, his tone brisk and professional. Diane launched into her narrative, her voice carrying the familiar, commanding cadence she used to order subordinates around the extraction firm. She outlined the charges, dismissing them as a ridiculous misunderstanding orchestrated by a jealous stepdaughter. She demanded immediate representation, instructing the lawyer to file for an emergency bail hearing. The attorney listened patiently. When she finished, he delivered the reality check. Representation of this magnitude against federal espionage and fraud charges required a substantial retainer. He quoted a figure in the hundreds of thousands, payable immediately, before he would even file a notice of appearance. Diane scoffed, offended by the suggestion that money was an issue. She reached into her pocket, extracting the one item the intake officers allowed her to keep until processing was complete. Her platinum corporate credit card, the physical embodiment of her stolen power. She read the 16-digit number aloud, her voice dripping with arrogant confidence. She recited the expiration date and the security code, expecting the transaction to process instantly, unlocking the gates of her cell. The attorney paused, the sound of typing echoing over the line. A long, agonizing silence stretched across the connection. Diane tapped her manicured fingernails against the plastic phone casing, impatient for her release. "I am sorry, Mrs. Bailey," the attorney finally said, his professional tone cooling significantly. "The transaction was declined." Diane frowned, her confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. "That is impossible," she snapped. "Run it again. It is a corporate platinum account. There is no limit." "I just ran it a second time." The lawyer confirmed, the distinct sound of a closing file folder audible in the background. "The terminal indicates the account has been permanently deactivated by the primary account holder. The card is dead." The blood drained from Diane's face. The full, crushing weight of my father's swift retaliation crashed over her. She stared at the small rectangle of plastic in her hand. It was no longer a key to a luxurious life. It was a worthless piece of polymer. Furthermore, the attorney continued, ensuring the final nail was driven deep. "A colleague at the courthouse just informed me that an emergency injunction has been filed, freezing all of your personal and shared assets. Even if you could provide a different account, those funds are legally inaccessible. I cannot represent you without a retainer, Mrs. Bailey. I suggest you request a public defender." The line clicked dead. A dial tone buzzed in Diane's ear. She slowly lowered the receiver, the realization setting in like a physical blow. She was completely isolated. The millions she had meticulously siphoned into offshore accounts were currently being traced and seized by forensic auditors. The joint accounts were frozen. Her corporate access was terminated. The illusion of wealth and power she had wielded like a weapon was entirely annihilated. The federal agent stepped forward, his face an impassive mask. He held out his hand. "Time is up," the agent stated dryly. "Hand over the card. You are not going to need it where you are going." Diane surrendered the platinum card, her fingers trembling. She had spent 3 years building a house of cards on a foundation of deceit and stolen capital. Now she was standing in the ruins, entirely destitute, facing the cold, unyielding machinery of the federal justice system. The tactical purge was complete, but the final legal execution, the true poetic justice, was still waiting to be delivered. The terminal windows rattled against a sudden gust of wind sweeping down from the Teton Range. James turned away from the glass, his silhouette sharp against the gray afternoon light. He looked at David Caldwell, our senior litigation counsel, who was already typing rapid notes into a secured digital tablet. "The criminal charges are in the hands of the federal prosecutor." James stated, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded the space around us. "But I want the civil retaliation filed before the sun sets. Draft the divorce papers today, David." David paused his typing, looking up with a calculating gaze. "Standard dissolution, or are we citing fault due to the fraud?" "Cite the fraud," James replied, his jaw tight. "Cite the theft. Cite the corporate treason. I want it all on the public record. There will be no mediation. There will be no settlement discussions. She does not get to sit across a mahogany table and negotiate for a fraction of my company. Offer her nothing." I watched my father sever a 3-year marriage with the exact same clinical precision he used to cap a depleted oil well. The illusion of a happy blended family was dead, and he was burying the remains under a mountain of inescapable legal paperwork. He was not acting out of wounded pride. He was protecting the empire his grandfather had started with a single drill rig. Ethan stepped closer, adjusting the collar of his suit. "The authorities have the offshore routing numbers," he offered, pulling a secondary file from his briefcase. "But recovering funds from a Cayman trust can take months, sometimes years, depending on their cooperation." "We are not waiting on international bureaucracy," James countered, his eyes narrowing with a fierce strategic focus. "David, prepare a civil lawsuit targeting Diane and Ashley directly. Sue them for the stolen $4 million, plus punitive damages for the attempted sabotage of our extraction leases. I want forensic accounting teams embedded in the civil suit. We are going to trace every penny she ever spent using our accounts. I want liens placed on any property she might have transferred to third parties. If she bought a designer handbag with stolen funds, I want the court to seize it and sell it at auction." David's digital pen flew across his tablet screen. The Wyoming courts take corporate fraud within the energy sector very seriously. Given the scale of the theft and the intent to commit espionage, securing a prejudgment attachment on her known assets will be straightforward. She will have zero liquidity to fight us. Good James said the word, hitting the air like a hammer striking an anvil. She thought she could siphon the lifeblood of this company and walk away untouched. I am going to ensure the legal fees alone keep her destitute. She traded her future for a phantom bank account. This was the unforgiving reality of American litigation. The criminal justice system takes your freedom, but the civil courts take everything else. Diane was about to be caught in a vice grip of depositions, discovery requests, and asset forfeiture. Even if a federal judge showed leniency on the espionage charges, the civil judgment would act as a permanent financial anchor. She would never climb out from under the debt. She would never own a home. She would never hold a bank account that could not be garnished. The court would seize any future income, redirecting it straight back into the Bailey firm's coffers. She had traded her luxurious Wyoming lifestyle for a lifetime of indentured servitude to the court system. While James orchestrated the financial ruin of his soon-to-be ex-wife, a sudden murmur rippled through the terminal waiting area behind us. Passengers waiting for their delayed flights were pointing at the overhead monitors suspended from the ceiling. A breaking news banner crawled across the bottom of the screens, flashing bright red against the standard broadcast graphics. I walked toward the nearest television, my boots clicking softly on the terrazzo floor. The local affiliate had wasted zero time. The Jackson Hole Airport is small, and a swarm of federal tactical vehicles pulling up to the main terminal does not go unnoticed. News crews had dispatched helicopters and ground teams within minutes of the initial siren. The screen displayed high-definition footage captured just outside the Federal Holding Annex downtown. It was the quintessential perp walk, a ritual designed to strip high-profile suspects of their dignity before they ever see a judge. Ashley filled the center of the frame. Her blush-pink designer sweater was wrinkled and stained with dirt from her collapse on the security checkpoint floor. The pristine, curated aesthetic she spent thousands of hours perfecting for her internet followers was entirely erased. Her hair clung to her face in damp, messy strands. Heavy steel handcuffs bound her wrists, her hands clasped awkwardly in front of her waist. Two stern tactical agents flanked her, gripping her arms and guiding her toward the courthouse steps. A throng of local reporters and freelance photographers surged against the police barricades. The rapid burst of camera flashes illuminated Ashley's tear-streaked face in a harsh, unforgiving light. Microphones were thrust into the air, catching the chaotic shouts of journalists demanding answers about the corporate espionage charges. Ashley ducked her head, trying to hide from the relentless lenses, but there was nowhere to take cover. The girl who had spent her entire morning desperate to broadcast my humiliation was now the starring attraction on every news feed in the state. She had adjusted her portable ring light in the VIP lounge, eagerly planning to go viral by live-streaming a staged federal arrest. The universe possesses a remarkable, chilling sense of irony. She achieved her goal. She was going viral. The footage of her weeping in federal custody was already circulating across social media platforms, accumulating millions of views, immortalizing her disgrace for the entire world to see. Her smartphone, the weapon she intended to use against me, was currently locked inside an evidence bag, being dismantled by cyber technicians. She had no control over the narrative. She could not apply a flattering filter, delete the negative comments, or post a tearful apology video. The raw, unfiltered truth of her crime was broadcasted directly into the homes of the very socialites and influencers she had tried so desperately to impress. The terminal around us grew quiet as more travelers noticed the breaking news. A crowd gathered near the food court, faces turned upward, watching the drama unfold on the suspended screens. I heard a woman gasp, clutching her coffee cup, as the news anchor detailed the estimated value of the stolen survey maps. The sheer audacity of the crime captured the attention of the entire transit hub. The reporter on the screen interviewed a local legal analyst who speculated on the severity of the charges. The analyst spoke of federal sentencing guidelines, mandatory minimums, and the unforgiving nature of corporate espionage statutes. Ashley had wanted a scandal to destroy my credibility, but she had unwittingly cast herself as the lead villain in a true crime saga. Ethan came to stand beside me, his shoulder brushing against mine. He watched the screen, his expression unreadable. We had spent countless late nights hunting phantom vendors through digital ledgers, waiting for the moment the trap would finally snap shut on the perpetrators. Seeing it manifest on a television screen, seeing the tangible, real-world consequences of our quiet labor brought a profound sense of closure. "She wanted an audience," Ethan murmured, his voice barely rising above the chatter of the terminal. "She got one. The biggest audience she will ever have," I agreed, turning away from the monitor. The spectacle was over. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the restroom discovery, the silent transfer of the geological tube, and the intense interrogation was beginning to fade. In its place, a deep, resonant exhaustion settled into my bones. The threat was neutralized, the enemy was stripped of their weapons, and the empire was secured. Yet the aftermath of a war always leaves debris in its wake. My father was still standing by the window, staring out at the runway, a solitary figure bearing the heavy cost of his own survival. The immediate danger had passed, but we now faced the daunting task of returning to an estate that had been cleansed by fire. The foundation was intact, but we had to return to the quiet aftermath and determine exactly what kind of structure we were going to build upon it next. The town car idled at the curb just outside the arrivals terminal, its dark-tinted windows offering a final layer of insulation from the chaos we were leaving behind. The driver, a trusted company veteran named Marcus, who had worked for my father for nearly 2 decades, stood by the rear passenger door. He didn't ask questions, he simply offered a respectful nod, opening the door wide as we approached. I slid into the plush leather seat, the familiar scent of the interior serving as an immediate grounding mechanism. My father slid in beside me, and Ethan took the seat opposite us. The heavy doors closed, sealing us inside a quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary. The engine hummed to life, and the car merged smoothly onto the highway, heading north toward the estate. The ride began in absolute silence. It was not the tense, suffocating silence of the interrogation room, nor the heavy, awkward quiet that had plagued our family dinners for the past 3 years. This was a secure, profound silence. It was the sound of a structural collapse finally settling, the dust clearing to reveal the bedrock beneath. I looked out the window. The Wyoming landscape stretched out before us, vast and uncompromising. The high plains rolled toward the jagged peaks of the Tetons, the early evening light casting long, deep shadows across the sagebrush. This land does not suffer fools, and it does not forgive weakness. It demands resilience. My father built his life mirroring that exact geography, and for a brief, dangerous window, he had allowed a parasite to compromise that foundation. He leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes. The deep lines etched into his face seemed less like marks of age and more like battle scars. He had aged 10 years in the span of 3 hours. "I am sorry," Laura James said. His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual booming authority, but it carried an undeniable weight. I turned my head, looking at him in the dim light of the cabin. I should have seen it. He continued, opening his eyes and meeting my gaze directly. I should have recognized what she was doing. The isolation tactics, the constant friction she manufactured between us. I let my desire for a peaceful home override my judgment. I put my comfort above your protection, and I nearly cost you your freedom. I didn't offer a platitude. I didn't tell him it was all right, because it wasn't. The betrayal was severe, and the consequences had nearly been catastrophic. But I also understood the mechanics of the trap Diane had built. She was a master manipulator, preying on his blind spots with surgical precision. "You built a fortress, Dad," I replied, my tone even and measured. "And she convinced you she was the gatekeeper. She used your own strength against you, but when the walls breached, you didn't hesitate. You made the calls. You severed the infection." He nodded slowly, accepting the assessment. The regret would linger a permanent scar on his personal history, but the corporate entity was secure. The $4 million she had siphoned was already frozen, locked down by international injunctions drafted by David Caldwell before we even left the airport. The phantom vendors were neutralized. The offshore accounts were paralyzed. The financial hemorrhage had been stopped completely. Ethan broke the silence, shifting in his seat. "The cyber division confirmed they have the original digital blueprints she tried to smuggle, hun," he reported, scrolling through a secured message on his tablet. "The physical maps are locked in federal evidence, but the proprietary data never reached the rival firm. The extraction leases for the Yellowstone border tracts are safe. The auction proceeds exactly as planned next quarter." That was the final piece of the puzzle locking into place. The empire remained entirely intact, The external threat of corporate espionage was neutralized, and the internal threat of domestic sabotage was currently sitting in a federal holding cell facing decades of incarceration. The town car turned off the main highway, tires crunching onto the long, winding gravel driveway leading to the Bailey estate. The sprawling log and stone structure sat against a backdrop of pine trees, its large windows glowing with warm light against the gathering dusk. It was the same house I had left that morning, but it felt fundamentally different. The oppressive, toxic energy Diane had cultivated within those walls had vanished. The air was clear. We stepped out of the vehicle, the crisp evening breeze biting at our coats. My father stopped at the base of the stone steps leading to the front door. He turned to me, extending his hand. It wasn't a familial embrace, it was a firm, professional grip. The kind of handshake shared between partners who have just weathered a brutal corporate siege. "You saved this company today, Laura," James stated, his voice recovering its familiar strength. "Your compliance training, your discipline. You saw the liability and you neutralized it without triggering the alarm until the exact right moment. You outmaneuvered a predator in real time." I returned his grip, feeling the rough calluses on his palm. "I simply applied the risk management protocols you taught me," I said. "Identify the hidden threat, isolate the variable, execute the solution." He offered a brief, firm nod of profound respect. The dynamic between us had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer just the daughter navigating a blended family. I was the heir apparent, the tactical safeguard of the Bailey legacy. Ethan walked up the steps, unlocking the heavy wooden door. We stepped inside the grand foyer. The house was completely silent, devoid of Diane's shrill demands or Ashley's manufactured drama. It felt empty, but it was a clean, healthy emptiness. It was a blank canvas, ready to be rebuilt. The chaos they intended for me had entirely consumed them instead. Diane and Ashley had weaponized the federal justice system, hoping to use its crushing weight to bury me. They failed to realize that when you activate a machine of that magnitude, you must ensure your own hands are clean. They stepped into the gears of their own trap. There is a distinct poetic justice in the mechanics of greed. When you utilize ruthless, malicious tactics to strip away the assets and the hard-earned reputation of another person, you inevitably leave fatal vulnerabilities in your own plan. Digging a deep grave to bury your own family member will only result in your own panic and selfishness pushing you directly into the bottom of that exact pit. There is no calculated betrayal or sinister conspiracy that can successfully defeat meticulous preparation and a completely cold, analytical mind. Objective truth and rigid logic will always shatter the most perfect, carefully constructed facade. When you attempt to weaponize the system against an innocent target, you must be prepared to face the devastating consequences when the system turns its full power against you instead. Diane wanted to secure an empire. She secured a cell block. Ashley wanted to broadcast a scandal. She became the headline. The ledger was finally balanced, the accounts were settled, and the high plains of Wyoming remained exactly as they always were, unforgiving to those who underestimate the terrain, and fiercely protective of those who understand how to survive the storm. Thank you for listening and staying with me until the very final minutes of this story. I truly appreciate your continued support and engagement throughout this journey. What are your thoughts on the uncompromising legal and financial punishments handed down to Diane and Ashley? Do you think they got exactly what they deserved? Please share your perspectives and opinions right down in the comments section below. There is a profound myth woven deeply into the fabric of the traditional American family. A pervasive illusion that continues to quietly destroy homes from the inside out. We are taught to measure a family's success by its outward metrics: the sprawling estate at the end of a winding driveway, the prestigious corporate titles, the flawless holiday photographs, and the accumulation of generational wealth. We equate financial provision with successful parenting, assuming that a roof over a child's head and a trust fund in their name inherently equates to a well-guided life. But as the stories of Laura, Vanessa, and young Charlie so brutally illustrate, the American dream becomes a suffocating nightmare when the moral foundation of a family is entirely hollowed out by cowardice, greed, and a staggering lack of emotional awareness. Look closely at the fathers we have encountered. Men who build empires of steel mineral extraction and real estate. They were titans in the boardroom, yet absolute cowards at the dinner table. In American culture, we often praise the stoic provider, the patriarch, who works tirelessly to secure the family's material future. Yet these men failed at the most fundamental responsibility of parenting, protecting the innocent from the malicious. They turned a blind eye to the toxic friction within their own homes, dismissing targeted emotional abuse as mere blended family growing pains. They prioritized a superficial domestic peace over objective truth, allowing their ambitious new wives to slowly poison the well. This is the tragedy of emotional unawareness. When a parent refuses to see the suffering of their own flesh and blood simply because acknowledging it would require conflict, they are not keeping the peace. They are actively participating in the abuse. Fairness in a family is not merely about dividing assets equally in a will. It is about establishing a rigid boundary of respect and enforcing severe consequences when that boundary is crossed. By remaining silent, these fathers taught their daughters that their pain was an acceptable price to pay for the patriarch's comfort. It took the cold, undeniable shock of federal handcuffs and forensic audits to wake them from their willful slumber. A reckoning that arrived far too late to salvage the years of emotional neglect. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we see the devastating results of corrupted maternal guidance. Stepmothers like Diane and Brenda viewed their own biological daughters not as human beings to be nurtured with honesty and integrity, but as accomplices in their pursuit of unearned status. They raised young women who believed that their worth was intrinsically tied to the designer labels on their bags and the carat weight of stolen diamonds. In attempting to secure a luxurious future for their children, they entirely neglected to build their character. When a parent shields a child from the consequences of their actions, inflating their ego while starving their moral compass, they are not loving that child. They are fashioning a predator. Ashley and Chelsea were taught that the rules of fairness did not apply to them, that they were entitled to the fruits of someone else's labor. But the real world, governed by rigid laws and objective truths, eventually comes to collect. In the end, these mothers did not secure a financial dynasty for their daughters. They secured their public humiliation, criminal records, and total financial ruin. They dug a pit for others, only to push their own children directly into the abyss. But then there is the counter-narrative, the quiet, observant grace of a retired history teacher named Harold. Here we find the true essence of long-term guidance and the saving grace of the American family. Harold was not a billionaire. He did not command a boardroom. But he possessed the rarest and most valuable parenting skill of all: emotional awareness. He understood that true guidance does not always announce itself with loud discipline or grand gestures. Sometimes it is the ability to look at a 9-year-old boy sitting at a kitchen table and recognize the profound terror hiding behind a perfectly still posture. Harold paid attention to the silence. He noticed the trembling hand, the careful eyes scanning the driveway, the unnatural quiet of a child who had learned to navigate a domestic minefield. When Charlie took the terrifying risk of sliding that folded note across the table, Harold did not dismiss him as an overactive child with an active imagination. He honored the boy's courage with immediate, absolute belief. He modeled the highest virtue of family responsibility, utilizing patient strategy and unyielding honesty to neutralize a lethal threat. He taught his grandson that he was not alone, that truth is a shield, and that adults can, in fact, be trusted to do the right thing when the dark closes in. We are taught by conventional society that the greatest virtue of a family is unconditional unity. The idea that blood is thicker than water, and that we must protect our own at all costs, hiding our ugly secrets behind closed mahogany doors. But this is a dangerous fallacy. Unconditional loyalty, when divorced from morality, is not love, it is complicity. The most profound act of parenting is not protecting your child from the harshness of the world, but protecting the world from what your child might become if left unchecked. True love is sometimes allowing the system to completely crush the very people you share a roof with, recognizing that excising a toxic tumor is the only way to save the healthy tissue that remains. The ultimate responsibility of a family is not to hoard wealth or project an image of flawless harmony, but to raise human beings who possess the grit to stand in the freezing rain and speak the truth even when their voice shakes. If these reflections resonate with the quiet truths you carry in your own life, I invite you to join our community. Hit like and subscribe, and follow Zara Told Stories for more narratives that explore the darkest corners and the brightest triumphs of the human experience. When you sit at your own kitchen table tomorrow morning, listening to the hum of your refrigerator and the breathing of the people you love most, ask yourself a very simple question. Are you building a sanctuary of honesty and awareness? Or are you just desperately keeping the peace while the foundation quietly rots away beneath your feet? The answer, if you are brave enough to finally look at it, changes absolutely everything.